When hikers found a 60-year-old truck driver's skeleton inside a rusted logging truck deep in the Oregon wilderness in 2015, investigators faced an impossible mystery. The truck sat surrounded by 200-year-old trees that had never been disturbed, miles from any road, in a location no vehicle could possibly reach. The hikers found the truck on a Tuesday morning in October of 2015, hidden so deep in the forest that finding it felt like discovering a secret the woods had been keeping. They were off-trail, following a creek through old-growth timber in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, when they saw it through the trees. A logging truck from another era, dark red paint turned to rust, sitting among Douglas firs that had been standing for 200 years. The truck was a 1952 Kenworth, the kind of heavy hauler that moved timber before modern highways and regulations. It sat level on all tires, though the rubber had rotted to black fragments. The flatbed still carried a partial load of massive logs, old-growth fir that would be worth a fortune if it weren't slowly rotting into the forest floor. What stopped the hikers cold was not the truck itself, but its position. There was no road, no path, no cleared route that could explain how 8 tons of truck and timber had arrived at this spot. The male hiker approached first while his girlfriend hung back, filming on her phone. The driver's side door hung open slightly, sagging on rusted hinges. Inside the cab, Bones sat in the driver's seat, still wearing the remnants of flannel and denim, a skeletal hand resting on the steering wheel, as if the driver had simply stopped and never moved again. Personal effects scattered the cab floor: a thermos, a canvas bag, a logbook water damaged but still partially readable. The hikers called emergency services from a ridge where their phones caught signal. The dispatcher had trouble believing the description. A 50-year-old logging truck deep in roadless wilderness, a body inside, no visible way it could have gotten there. The couple waited at the site for 3 hours until county sheriff and Forest Service rangers arrived, climbing up the same creek bed because there was no other approach. The lead investigator photographed everything before touching anything. The truck's position made no sense by any standard of possibility. The surrounding trees showed no damage, no broken branches or scarred bark that would indicate a vehicle forcing its way through. The forest floor held no tire tracks, no furrows from dragging, no signs of earth disturbance. The Douglas firs around the truck were ancient and undisturbed, their root systems proving they had stood in those exact positions for centuries. Inside the cab, the medical examiner found a wallet with a driver's license. Raymond Hollister, born 1935, last renewed in 1994. Next to the bones lay the logbook, its pages brittle and stained but entries still visible. The last date recorded was December 18, 1995. 20 years earlier, almost to the day, someone ran the name through missing persons databases and found the cold case immediately. Raymond Hollister, reported missing December of 95, never found, presumed dead, case suspended after 2 years of no leads. Raymond Hollister was 60 years old when he vanished in December of 1995, though people who knew him said he seemed older, worn down by something that had nothing to do with age. He was an independent trucker, one of the last drivers who owned his own rig and hauled timber on contract for whoever was paying. His truck was a restored 1952 Kenworth that he called Old Reliable, maintained with obsessive care, painted dark red, older than most of the men he competed against for loads. He lived in a small house outside Oak Ridge, Oregon, timber country where logging was dying and everyone knew it. His wife Ellen was a quiet woman who kept the house and asked few questions about Ray's long absences between hauls. They had married late, both in their 40s, after his first wife left and her husband died. It was a practical arrangement more than a romantic one, 2 people tired of being alone who agreed to be alone together. The dispatcher at Cascade Timber Mill remembered Ray's last job clearly because it was unusual. December 12, 1995, Ray loaded 40,000 pounds of old-growth Douglas fir, premium logs worth serious money. The buyer was a specialty mill in Portland that paid top dollar for old growth. It should have been a straightforward run, 4 hours on Highway 26, easy money for an experienced driver. Ray checked the load securement, filled out the paperwork, and told the dispatcher he was taking the long way. The dispatcher asked what he meant by that. Ray said something about avoiding traffic, about preferring Forest Service roads to highways. The dispatcher thought it was odd, but not alarming. Ray was known for being particular about his routes, for taking extra time if it meant driving through prettier country. Independent contractors could do what they wanted, as long as the load arrived on schedule. He left the mill at 2 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight left even in December. The buyer in Portland expected him by 7 that evening. When Ray did not arrive and did not call, the mill contacted Ellen. She was not surprised. Ray sometimes extended trips, camping somewhere in the mountains, losing track of time. She gave it 2 days before filing a missing persons report. The police investigation found nothing. Ray's truck was too old for GPS tracking. No cameras caught him on any highway. The Forest Service roads he preferred were remote and unmonitored. His CB radio stayed silent. Search teams drove every logging road between Oak Ridge and Portland, found no trace of the truck, no signs of accident or breakdown. It was as if Ray and Old Reliable had simply driven off the edge of the map. Ellen waited through that winter and into spring, expecting news that never came. The police eventually classified it as voluntary disappearance. A 60-year-old man with a valuable truck and cargo, no debts, no obvious problems, just gone. The case went cold. Ellen collected a small life insurance payout after 7 years and tried to accept that she would never know what happened to her husband. Raymond Hollister was born in 1935 in a logging camp outside Eugene, the second son of a timber faller and a camp cook. His childhood was defined by the Depression, by moving between camps as work dried up and started again, by the understanding that survival meant hard work and no complaints. His father died in a felling accident when Ray was 12, crushed by a widowmaker that fell from a damaged tree. His mother moved the family to town, took work as a seamstress, raised her boys alone. Ray was 14 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, 16 when he decided he could not wait any longer to join the fight. He was tall for his age and mature-faced, looked 18 if you did not examine too closely. He lied about his birth date on the enlistment papers, said he was born in 33 instead of 35, and the recruiter in Eugene either believed him or did not care. The Marines needed bodies and Ray wanted to go. Those two facts were sufficient. He shipped out in August of 1944, trained at Camp Pendleton for 6 weeks, basic infantry skills and weapons drill compressed into crash course for wartime deployment. The other recruits in his platoon were mostly his real age or younger, boys pretending to be men, practicing toughness they did not feel. Ray kept quiet and followed orders and tried not to think about what was coming. His unit deployed to the Pacific in September, assigned to the 1st Marine Division, replacement troops for casualties that were not discussed but understood. They landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944, part of an operation that was supposed to take 3 days and would take 2 months. Ray was 16 years old and had never heard a shot fired in anger when he climbed down the cargo net into the landing craft. The beach landing was chaos that exceeded description or preparation. Artillery and mortar fire from positions the Navy bombardment had not touched. Machine gun crossfire from concrete bunkers built into coral ridges. Men falling before they reached the sand, bodies floating in shallow water, screaming that got lost in the noise of explosions. Ray made it to the beach because luck and random chance put him in spaces where bullets were not, nothing more complicated than that. His unit pushed inland toward the airfield, fighting for ground measured in yards, every advance paid for in casualties. The Japanese defenders occupied caves in the coral ridges, interconnected positions that could not be bombed or shelled into submission, had to be taken one by one with flamethrowers and grenades, and close-range fighting. Ray learned that war was nothing like the movies, was mostly noise and confusion, and trying not to die in the next 30 seconds. He survived the first day because he followed the man in front of him, and did what he was told. That night, huddled in a shell crater with 5 other Marines, he understood that he had made a terrible mistake and there was no way to undo it. The fighting on Peleliu lasted 2 months and destroyed most of the men who survived it. The island was 8 square miles of coral ridges and caves, defended by Japanese forces who had fortified every position and planned to sell their lives as expensively as possible. There was no quick victory, no dramatic breakthrough, just grinding attrition that consumed units and replaced them with fresh troops who would also be consumed. Ray's platoon spent the first week fighting for the airfield, advancing across open ground under fire from ridges they could not see. Men fell and were replaced and fell again. The heat was murderous, over 100 degrees, and water ran out faster than supply lines could maintain. Wounded men died of dehydration before they could be evacuated. The living fought and dug and waited for their turn to die. The second week, Ray's unit was assigned to cave-clearing operations in the Umerbrogel ridges, terrain so broken and complex that maps were useless. The caves were connected by tunnels, some natural and some engineered, and Japanese defenders moved between positions underground, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. You cleared a cave with grenades and flamethrowers, declared it secure, and an hour later took fire from the same position. Ray learned to function on no sleep and constant fear. His body moved through the motions while his mind went somewhere else, a dissociation that let him keep operating when rational thought would have meant paralysis. He stopped thinking about home or future, stopped thinking about anything except the immediate next task. Eat when food appeared, drink when water came, shoot when targets showed, sleep when ordered. Exist in 30-second intervals. The incident that broke something fundamental happened in the third week. Ray's squad was sheltering in captured caves, while artillery pounded the ridges above, American and Japanese fire overlapping, the island itself seeming to shake apart. The cave system was extensive, multiple chambers connected by low passages, still containing Japanese dead that nobody had time to remove. The smell was overwhelming, death and coral dust and explosive residue. They stayed in those caves for 18 hours, while the artillery duel continued overhead. Ray found a small chamber in the back, away from the others, and discovered he could make the fear stop if he held completely still. Not just motionless, but absent, mentally gone, present in body but not consciousness. He practiced this absence, refined it, found that he could exist in a state where nothing touched him because he was not really there to be touched. When the barrage ended, and they emerged, Ray was different. His squad mates noticed but said nothing. Everyone dealt with the horror their own way. Ray had found a method of survival that worked, a way to endure the unendurable by not being present for it. He would use this skill for the rest of the campaign, and then for the rest of his life. Ray survived Peleliu because luck kept him in places where death was not, nothing more complex than random chance. His unit lost 60% casualties over 2 months of fighting. Most of the men he landed with were dead or permanently broken. Ray collected a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds that were minor enough not to warrant evacuation, stayed with his unit through the final mopping up operations in November of 1944. He shipped back to Pavuvu for rest and refit, 2 months of recovery on another Pacific island that was only marginally more pleasant than a combat zone. The Marines around him were hollow-eyed and silent, processing things that could not be discussed. Ray wrote letters home that said he was fine and described tropical weather and asked about timber prices. He did not mention caves or coral dust or the smell that would not wash out of his clothing. His unit was assigned to Okinawa in April of 1945, another island invasion, another campaign of attrition. Ray landed with the assault waves and fought through 3 months of mud and rain and casualties that made Peleliu seem like a warm-up. The dissociative skill he had learned served him well. He could function in combat while being mentally absent, a body that followed orders while the consciousness that would have felt fear or horror simply left until it was safe to return. The atomic bombs ended the war before Ray's unit was scheduled for the Guden invasion of mainland Japan, a landing that would likely have killed everyone involved. Ray was occupying a captured position on Okinawa when news came that Japan had surrendered. The men around him celebrated with exhausted relief. Ray felt nothing, had been feeling nothing for so long that the absence of fear and the presence of peace were indistinguishable. He rotated back to the States in October of 1945, processed through Camp Pendleton, received his discharge papers and back pay and bus ticket home. He was 17 years old and legally old enough to drink now that the war was over. The Marines knew his real age by then but did not care. He had served honorably and survived. Those were the only facts that mattered. He took the bus to Eugene, showed up at his mother's house without warning, a stranger in Marine Corps dress uniform. She cried when she saw him, had thought he was older when he enlisted, had been terrified the whole time he was gone. Ray hugged her and said he was fine and deflected every question about the war with vague responses about tropical islands and boring duty. His younger brother asked if Ray had killed anyone. Ray said he did not want to talk about it, and his mother told his brother to stop asking questions. He was home 3 days before he understood he could not stay. The house felt wrong, the town felt wrong, civilian life felt like a costume he could not wear convincingly. Everything was too loud and too quiet simultaneously, too full of people who had not been to war and could not understand what it required. Ray left home in January of 1946, told his mother he needed to work, moved back into timber country where questions were fewer. He hired on with a logging outfit, working old growth in the Cascades, dangerous work that paid well and asked nothing except physical labor and risk tolerance. The timber camps were full of men who did not want to talk about where they had been or why they were there. Nobody asked questions about Ray's silences or his habit of sleeping outside his tent even in winter. He worked as a choker setter first, the most dangerous job in the operation, wrapping steel cables around logs so they could be dragged by tractors to the landing. Men died regularly when cables snapped or logs rolled, crushed, or cut in half by forces that exceeded human reaction time. Ray was good at it because fear did not slow him down. He could work in the absent state where danger was theoretical rather than immediate. He got a reputation for being reliable and slightly strange, a combination that worked in the timber industry. The years after the war blurred together. Ray moved between camps, following work, saving money he did not spend. He learned all the logging jobs, faller and bucker and rigging slinger, competent at everything but exceptional at nothing. He preferred jobs that kept him away from people, positions where he worked alone, or with minimal crew. The forest was easier to tolerate than civilization. Trees did not ask questions or expect emotional responses Ray could not produce. He married for the first time in 1952, a hasty mistake with a woman he met in a tavern in Oak Ridge. She was pretty and lonely and thought Ray's silence meant depth rather than absence. The marriage lasted 4 years before she left, tired of living with a man who was never fully present, who disappeared into the woods for weeks without explanation, who flinched at loud noises and could not sleep through the night without waking in states she did not understand, and he would not explain. Ray transitioned to truck driving in the late 50s, buying a used logging truck and going independent. The work suited him better than crew jobs, hours alone in the cab, driving Forest Service roads through wilderness, delivering loads and moving on before anyone expected conversation. He bought the 1952 Kenworth in '63, restored it over 2 years, made it his home more than any house or apartment he rented. The pattern of his life became established and repeated. Take jobs, haul loads, disappear between contracts to camp alone in the mountains. He would vanish for days or weeks, living out of the truck or a tent, existing in forests that felt safer than towns. People who knew him learned not to ask where he went, or why, accepted that Ray Hollister was functional but fundamentally broken in ways that could not be fixed and should not be questioned. He married Ellen in 1980, both of them middle-aged and practical about what they expected from partnership. She gave him space, he gave her stability, they lived together without pretending to fully understand each other. The last months of 1995 showed changes in Ray that Ellen noticed but could not interpret. He had always been quiet and distant, but that fall he became obsessed with old-growth timber in ways that seemed to exceed professional interest. He drove routes specifically to see ancient trees, would stop and spend hours walking among Douglas firs and cedars that had been standing for centuries. He talked about these trees as if they were people, referred to them as witnesses to time. Ellen found him one night in November, sitting at the kitchen table with maps spread out, Forest Service maps marked with circles and notes in his cramped handwriting. She asked what he was looking for. He said he was trying to find a specific place, somewhere he needed to go. She asked what place. He said somewhere the trees remembered, where time was different. His voice when he said this was strange, distant, as if he was talking from somewhere else. He became agitated around the anniversary of Peleliu, which Ellen knew about because she had found his discharge papers years earlier and done the math. September 15 through November 27, the dates of the campaign. Ray never mentioned the war directly, but his behavior changed during May, those months every year. Sleeping less, eating less, spending more time alone in the woods. This year was worse than usual, the 50th anniversary of something that had never stopped happening in his mind. He told her in early December, rare openness after 20 years of silence, that he had been living on borrowed time since 1944. She did not understand what he meant. He explained that he should have died on Peleliu, that everyone in his unit should have died, and surviving meant owing a debt that could not be paid in normal life. The trees knew, he said, because they were there before the war, and would be there after, existed in time that exceeded human violence. Ellen suggested he see someone, a counselor or doctor who specialized in war trauma. Ray said it was too late for that, had been too late for 50 years. He was not asking for help, was not complaining, was simply explaining something he thought she should know. Then he went quiet again and would not discuss it further. December 12, the day he took his last load, he seemed calm in a way that frightened Ellen more than agitation. He kissed her goodbye that morning, unusual gesture from a man who rarely showed physical affection. He told her not to worry if he was gone longer than expected. She asked how long. He said, as long as it took. She watched him drive away in Old Reliable, the truck he loved more than anything except possibly the forest itself. When he did not return and did not call, Ellen waited 2 days as she always did, then filed the missing persons report. The police officer taking the statement asked about Ray's state of mind, whether he had seemed depressed or suicidal. Ellen said no, which was not exactly true but not exactly false either. Ray had not seemed depressed, had seemed decided, resolved, moving towards something rather than away from something, and she did not know how to explain the difference. The police investigation in December of 1995 followed standard procedures and found nothing useful. Ray's truck was too old for modern tracking systems, no GPS or electronic logging devices. His route was supposed to be Highway 26 to Portland, straightforward run on a major highway with truck stops and way stations that should have created a paper trail. None of the expected checkpoints reported seeing him or Old Reliable. Investigators interviewed the dispatcher at Cascade Timber Mill, who remembered Ray saying he was taking the long way but could not specify what that meant. Ray had not filed a route plan, independent contractors were not required to. The cargo was valuable but not unusual, old growth logs that would bring premium price but were not worth stealing, too distinctive and too difficult to move without proper equipment and documentation. The search expanded to Forest Service roads, the maze of logging routes, and fire access tracks that covered the Cascade Mountains. Sheriff's deputies and volunteer search teams drove hundreds of miles of gravel and dirt roads, looking for signs of the distinctive red Kenworth with its load of massive logs. They found abandoned trucks and camps and trash dumps, the detritus of decades of logging, but nothing related to Ray Hollister. Helicopters ran search patterns over likely routes, looking for the truck or evidence of crash or breakdown. The winter weather complicated efforts, snow and rain limiting visibility and access. By January of '96, the search had produced no leads, no sightings, no physical evidence. Ray and his truck had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The investigation considered various theories. Voluntary disappearance scored high on the list. Ray was 60 with money in his pocket, a valuable truck and cargo, no obvious ties keeping him in Oregon. He could have driven to another state, sold the truck and logs, started over somewhere else. But this theory had problems. Ray had no record of planning or research, no withdrawn savings, no statements suggesting dissatisfaction with his life. And he loved that truck too much to sell it. Foul play was considered but seemed unlikely. Truck hijacking happened, but typically along major routes where thieves could quickly move stolen cargo. Hijacking a truck on a remote Forest Service road and then making both truck and driver disappear without trace required planning and resources that did not fit the scenario. Ray had no enemies, no debts, no involvement in anything that would attract criminal attention. Accident or breakdown seemed most probable, but the lack of evidence remained problematic. Even if Ray had gone off-road and crashed in remote terrain, the truck was large and distinctive, would be visible from air search. If he had broken down and tried to walk out, searchers should have found his body or the truck, or both. The Cascades were vast but not infinite. Systematic search should have produced results. By March of '96, the case was suspended, kept open but inactive. Ellen received sympathy and suggestions to accept that she might never know what happened. The consensus was that Ray had driven somewhere remote and died of accident or exposure, and the forest had simply hidden the evidence. 20 years passed while Old Reliable sat among ancient trees, slowly surrendering to weather and decay. The cab held Ray's bones, still seated behind the wheel, skeletal hands in position as if he might start the engine any moment. The forest absorbed the truck gradually, moss growing on metal surfaces, vine maple pushing through rust holes, Doug fir seedlings taking root in the load of rotting logs. The site existed in a pocket of wilderness that human activity had bypassed for decades. No logging roads came near, no trails, no reason for anyone to push through dense forest to reach that specific location. The old growth trees around the truck were the kind that timber companies had been seeking since the 1800s, massive specimens worth tens of thousands each. But they stood in a section too remote and steep for profitable extraction. They were witness trees, survivors of eras when most of their kind fell to saws and fire. The truck's position defied rational explanation by every measure investigators applied. The nearest Forest Service road was 3 miles away, separated from the site by terrain no vehicle could traverse. To drive a loaded logging truck to that spot would require either crossing a steep ravine that would flip the truck instantly, or navigating through old growth so dense that a man on foot would struggle to pass. Neither option was physically possible. Forensic analysis confirmed what visual inspection suggested. The surrounding trees were undamaged, their bark showed no scrapes or scars from vehicle contact. The forest floor was undisturbed, no tire tracks or crushed vegetation or signs of dragging. Soil sampling showed no compression patterns consistent with vehicle weight. The conclusion was inescapable and impossible. The truck was in a place it could not be, and had gotten there by means that did not exist. One forester, examining tree rings on a Doug fir standing 10 feet from the truck's bumper, determined the tree was 230 years old, and had never been disturbed by anything more violent than wind. The truck weighed 8 tons loaded. Driving past that tree should have damaged it severely, yet the bark was smooth and undisturbed, the root system intact. The tree had been standing there since before Oregon was a state, and nothing about the truck's presence changed that fact. Theories multiplied, but none survived scrutiny. The truck could not have been disassembled and carried in pieces. The frame was solid steel and too heavy for human transport. It could not have been airlifted. No helicopter in 1995 had the capacity to lift that weight, and the forest canopy was too dense for vertical extraction anyway. It could not have been there since before the trees grew. The truck was built in '52, and the trees were centuries old. The investigators eventually stopped trying to explain how, and focused on why. The logbook provided some answers, though the answers raised questions that were possibly worse than ignorance. Ray's entries from December of '95 sketched a picture of a man navigating by psychological landmarks rather than physical geography, driving not toward Portland but toward something only he could see. The logbook was water-damaged and partially illegible, but enough survived to reconstruct Ray's final journey. The entries began normally, standard driver notes about load weight and departure time and route planning. Then, on December 13th, one day after leaving the mill, the writing changed, became less technical and more reflective, observations that had nothing to do with commercial trucking. December 13th, afternoon, wrote that the trees were different than they used to be, smaller and younger, the old growth mostly gone except in protected areas. He was looking for trees that remembered, that had been standing during the war, that existed in time longer than human conflict. The entry included coordinates that investigators later determined corresponded to a Forest Service road east of Oak Ridge, legitimate route though out of the way for Portland delivery. December 14th, the entries became fragmented. Ray wrote about hearing artillery, about the sound carrying through trees the way it carried through coral ridges in the Pacific. He wrote about men in the timber, shadows that moved between trees, watching him. The handwriting was shakier, words crossed out and rewritten. A deteriorating mental state visible in the physical text. He mentioned the trees specifically, ancient Douglas firs, that had witnessed everything and forgotten nothing. He wrote that they were here before Peleyu, before the war, before Ray was born, and they would be here after. Being near them made time feel different, made 50 years feel like nothing, made the distance between 1944 and 95 collapse into something manageable. December 15th entry described leaving the main road, taking progressively smaller routes, following intuition rather than maps. He wrote about looking for a coordinate where past and present overlapped, where he could stop running from survival. The entry ended with a statement that he was getting close, that the trees were older here, that he could feel the rightness of the location. December 16th was almost incoherent. References to Peleliu and Oregon blended together, cave fighting mixed with forest descriptions, Japanese defenders confused with shadows between Douglas firs. Ray wrote about finding the cave, about going into the dark place where he could finally hold still, where absence became permanent rather than temporary strategy. The cave seemed to mean both the Peleyu positions and the space under Old Reliable's chassis, overlapping meanings and deteriorating prose. December 17th. Just fragments. The trees remember. They were here before. Time is different here. The debt comes due. Found the right place. This is where I stop. December 18th. The final entry was eerily calm and precise. Ray wrote that he had positioned the truck in old growth that had never been logged, surrounded by witness trees, in forest that existed outside the timeline of human violence. He described crawling under the chassis, into the dark space beneath the truck bed, among the roots of ancient trees. He wrote that he was finally staying dead this time, finally stopping, finally paying what he owed. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off as if he had simply stopped holding it. The psychological analysis came from Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma, who reviewed the case materials and Ray's history. Her report detailed what the investigation had suspected but not articulated, that Ray Hollister had been experiencing severe dissociative episodes related to unprocessed wartime trauma, and that his final journey was essentially elaborate suicide, dressed as navigation. Ray had developed dissociation as survival mechanism on Peleliu, the ability to mentally absent himself from unbearable circumstances while continuing to function physically. This skill had allowed him to endure sustained combat that broke other men, but it came with costs that compounded over decades. He never learned to stop dissociating, never developed healthy processing methods, spent 50 years alternating between presence and absence without ever fully integrating his experience. The anniversary effect was clear in retrospect. Every autumn Ray became increasingly unstable, September through November overlaying 1944 onto whatever current year he was occupying. Most years he managed the symptoms by isolating himself, disappearing into the forest until the worst passed. 1995 was the 50th anniversary, half-century marker that carried psychological weight, exceeding normal anniversary reactions. Dr. Chen identified the old-growth forest obsession as an attempt to find permanence that exceeded trauma. The ancient trees represented timescales where individual human violence became irrelevant, where wars were brief disturbances rather than defining events. Ray was seeking absolution from witnesses who had seen everything and would outlast everything, trying to locate himself in time that was not measured by combat anniversaries. The impossible location made psychological sense, even if it defied physical explanation. Ray needed to be somewhere no truck should be, needed his final position to be as impossible as his survival had been. He had spent 50 years living past the point where he should have died, existing in borrowed time, and his final act was to return that loan by placing himself outside normal geography, in a spot where the rules of possibility were suspended. The crawling under the truck paralleled the cave behavior on Peleliu, seeking dark enclosed spaces where he could practice the stillness he had perfected in combat. The difference was that this time he did not emerge, did not return from absence, finally committed to the death he had been rehearsing since 16 years old. Exposure killed him over several days, hypothermia in December weather, a slow shutdown that he apparently did not resist or attempt to prevent. Dr. Chen's conclusion was clinical but devastating. Ray Hollister had died on Peleliu in September of 1944, psychologically if not physically. Everything after was extended aftermath, a body surviving while the consciousness that made it a person slowly dissolved. By December of 95, the dissolution was complete, and what drove into the forest was just residual momentum, a corpse that had not yet stopped moving. The formal diagnosis was complex post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative features, but that clinical language felt inadequate to describe what had actually happened to Ray Hollister. Ellen Hollister died in 2009, 14 years after Ray vanished and 6 years before hikers found his truck. She had spent those 14 years in a state of unresolved grief, unable to fully mourn a husband who was missing rather than confirmed dead, unable to move forward while questions remained unanswered. The discovery came too late to provide her closure, became instead a story her daughter would have to process alone. Ray's remains were recovered from the truck site in November of 2015, a complex operation requiring helicopter support and specialized extraction team. The bones were transported to the medical examiner in Eugene, positively identified through dental records, officially confirming what everyone already knew. Raymond Hollister, missing since December of '95, dead for exactly 20 years, found an impossible location by hikers who were not looking for him. The funeral was arranged by Ray's stepdaughter, Ellen's child from her first marriage who had known Ray as a distant but not unkind presence in her childhood home. It was a small service, a dozen people in a funeral home in Oak Ridge, a few old truckers who remembered Ray, a couple of timber mill employees, the Forest Service ranger who had supervised the recovery operation. The hikers who found the truck did not attend but sent flowers. There was no military honor guard because nobody thought to request one. Ray's service records had been filed away decades earlier, his Purple Heart stored in a box in Ellen's attic, his status as Pacific War veteran forgotten by everyone except himself. The funeral director mentioned briefly that Ray had served in World War II, but did not elaborate, and nobody present knew the details of Peleliu or understood that they were burying a man who had been dying from war for 71 years. They buried him next to Ellen in the Oak Ridge Cemetery, a modest headstone listing both dates and no explanation. Raymond Hollister, 1935 to 1995, reunited with Ellen Marie Hollister, 1938 to 2009. Married 20 years, separated for 14, together again in the only permanence that matters. The headstone did not mention the truck or the forest or the impossible location or the 50 years of dissolution. The service lasted 30 minutes. A funeral director read generic passages about peace and rest. One of the old truckers told a brief story about Ray being reliable and professional. Nobody mentioned the war, nobody mentioned trauma, nobody said the word suicide, though everyone understood that was the true cause of death, just delayed by half a century. They lowered the casket, covered it with dirt, and dispersed to their separate lives. Old Reliable remained where Ray left it, too remote and difficult to recover, officially classified as abandoned vehicle in wilderness area. The Forest Service considered extraction, but determined the environmental damage of removing the truck would exceed the benefit of clearing the site. The decision was made to let nature reclaim it, a process already well underway. In 50 years the truck would be unrecognizable, in 100 it would be completely absorbed, and the ancient Douglas firs would continue standing as they had stood before Ray arrived, and would stand long after all evidence of him disappeared.